All right, welcome to Semper Sometimes with Benny. So I told you guys yesterday on my Facebook that I was actually going to be, having a lieutenant colonel on with us to just kind of start talking about, the burden of leadership, and just the way that things are differently, the different feelings that they might have, and also just how it is when ish being the one to issue the orders. So we have Lieutenant Colonel here with us. I don't want to mispronounce your name. So if you can just go ahead and introduce yourself, I'd appreciate that, sir.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. This is an honor. Having recently retired back in May, and navigating through the initial process of making that initial transition into the civilian world. I'll start by giving you my background. First things first, for everybody that's out there, my name is Lieutenant Colonel LtCol Warthen. Retired. I go by Alex. Long story there, long short story. Dad wanted me to be a junior. Mom wanted me to be an Alexander, so they compromised. So I became Alton Alexander, and I've gone by Alex the majority of my life. So there's that. 24 years in the Marine Corps as an infantry officer. Graduated from Norwich University back in 1997. For those that don't know, Norwich University is the oldest private military college in the country, the birthplace of ROTC, and I'll be heading up there this week for my 25th.
That's over in Vermont, right?
Yep, up in Vermont, up in beautiful Northfield, Vermont, smack dab in the middle of the state. So I'll be heading up there and taking my girlfriend and her son up there this weekend this week for the first time. So very excited about that, and gonna get the opportunity to see some people up there I have not seen in a very long time. So awesome. A little bit about me. Infantry officer by trade, but had a very diverse career, and I was blessed to have done a lot of different things. Commanded at various levels, did just about everything you can do in the infantry. Taught both resident and non-resident, parallel with my career, the majority of my career. So had the opportunity to educate and train an entire generation of young captains, and seeing them grow up to be majors and lieutenant colonels now is pretty exciting. Wow. Did not plan on making a Marine Corps career. I was going to do my 4.5 years and get out and do other things. But there were two things that happened. Number one, I got orders to MCRD San Diego and was a series commander, company commander out there, and absolutely loved it. Series command is hit and miss with people. It all is literally really just determined by the people that you end up working with. And I end up working with a great group of officers, some outstanding drill instructors, and just loved it. The hours were insane. Life in that recruit depot fishbowl can be pretty intense, but I really enjoyed it. And it was really my B billet that kept me in the Marine Corps more than my lieutenant time in the fleet. And then the second thing that happened was 9/11. 9/11 happened while I was on my B billet. Knowing the country was at war, I knew my personality, and everybody serves in their own way. So I have nothing against the guys and gals that were in at the time, made it to the end of their contracts, and then walked away to do other things. But I knew myself well enough to know that if I walked away then while the country was at war, there was a part of me that never would have, for lack of a better term, forgiven myself for that. So when 9/11 happened, I knew I was going to stay in and at least do my part. And then once I got, because again, one of the things we forgot about 9/11 here on the 25th anniversary or 20th anniversary of 9/11, that day we had no idea who we were going to be fighting against. We had an inclination that it was Al-Qaeda. We had an inclination it was bin Laden, but it was actually several days before we could really draw a circle and say, okay, this is where we're going, and then we're going to go to Afghanistan. And of course, in Iraq, kicked off after that, a few years after that. So, I knew that I wanted to stay in and do my part, and then reevaluate afterwards. So, grew up as an Army brat. My dad had a very interesting Army career. He was in the Army's Navy, which means I had a very unusual Army brat. Oh yeah. The Army has a huge maritime wing, logistics wing that most people don't know exists. At one time, the Army was able to brag that they had more ships than the Navy. So the vast majority of that occupational field is down in Hampton Roads, Virginia. So that's where I grew up. I went to middle school and high school there. Never moved. My dad retired out of there, and then settled in the area until he passed away a few years ago. So grew up in an Army family. Did Sea Cadets and ROTC, through middle school and high school. Went to a military college, and then did 24 years of active duty. So the military has been a part of my life my entire life. I am both, very thankful of the experience, thankful for what I gained and what I learned, but also very eager to go do other things.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you,
So,
like, with everything going on, from if if it started off as a young child all the way through now, like, how does it feel no longer, being in the Marine Corps? Like, it's got to be very different to not be on that side of the fence anymore.
It's mixed feelings. I had a brief stint as a defense contractor. I recently got a job working with another company, and it was, working in the Pentagon every day. It reminded me on a daily basis of everything I loved about the military and everything I hated about it, everything I miss, and everything that, motivated me to say it's time to leave.
But so before we get into what made you leave,
Sure.
So just so I have an understanding, in your 24 years in the Marine Corps, did you deploy a lot? Did you, especially
Sure.
as an infantry officer, I can imagine that you probably
quite a bit. Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about that, if you don't mind, sir?
Sure. I was blessed in the sense that I got to see the Marine Corps pre 9/11, post 9/11, and a glimpse of the Marine Corps as we're trying to make, the transition away from the global war on terrorism to pivot back towards our traditional missions in the Pacific. So I got to see the Marine Corps through 3 different phases. So as a lieutenant, did UDP to Okinawa. From Okinawa, did the entire Pacific Rim, went to Australia, Thailand, Korea, Japan, mainland Japan, and Okinawa, Guam. Bounced all over the place, and did sort of that traditional late '90s UDP deployment from Iraq. Came back. And then had the unique opportunity to do a deployment called Unitas, which now I think belongs to the reserves if they still do it. And that was a deployment down in South America.
Yes, I believe they do, because I think I've heard that before.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine just got back from a UDP, and I'm pretty sure that's what it sounded like that.
Yeah, and it was a very unique opportunity. One heck of an adventure. We deployed on the last LST on the East Coast, the USS Lemoore County, and one of the last Navy ships to ever deploy and not come back from deployment. And I'll tell you that whole story. That was an adventure. Spent some extended time in Colombia, working with the Colombia Marines, and also cut our teeth down there doing some counter drug and counter narcotics operations.
Oh, wow.
At a time, again, in the late '90s, Colombia was a very different place than it is now. And saw and experienced some things down in South America that I will never forget. Then we bounced from Colombia. We went to Ecuador, Peru, spent some extended time in Chile. Got to go to the Chilean Mountain Warfare Center when I was down there, which was amazing.
Oh, wow.
Went over to Argentina, had the best steak I've ever had in my life in Argentina. Then went up to Brazil, and then Puerto Rico. So, and I want to say that on odd years back then, the Unitas deployments also went to Africa. So our deployment didn't go to Africa. We focused primarily on South American operations. And while we were conducting Unitas, I want to say the USS Cole was attacked. So we had that going on, which is something that really sticks out in my memory really well. And as we were making the transit back home is when you had no one remembers this anymore. That's when you had all the controversy surrounding the 2000 elections, with the hanging chads in Florida and all the rest of that. So to tell you the story about the USS Lemoore County, the Lamar County last LSD on the East Coast. Not a very good crew. Definitely not the Navy's varsity. Pretty interesting. You know, that was kind of like my first introduction to the Gator Navy. And I was like, huh, okay, this is interesting. They ran aground off the coast of Chile during some joint combined operations with the Chilean Navy and some other South American navies. And they damaged the ship so badly that they couldn't bring it back to the States. So they had to tow the ship into port, docked there, strip everything off of value, and then they sank it the next year, the next Unitas. They just had a giant sink X, shot a bunch of missiles at it and sank it. So the ship never made it back. But they had to scramble a ship called the Tortuga, which I believe now is actually stationed out in the Pacific. And LSD, the Tortuga, that had just gotten back from deployment, they were like, hey, welcome home, get back on the ship, go down to South America, go pick up these Marines and complete the rest of the deployment. But they were awesome. You know, we expected them, considering the circumstances, to be, you know, we anticipated that they weren't going to be happy to see us. And with our last experience with our last Navy crew, we already had kind of an image of what we thought the Gator Navy was. The Tortuga showed up and was a completely different experience. Great ship, great crew, gained a lot of respect for the Navy and for the amphibious community when they're well run and well led. You know, again, this perspective of what, you know, a good Navy crew looks like under those circumstances. And they were actually pretty excited to come down there and pick us up, because getting the chance to go to South America is something that didn't happen very often in the Navy back then. So they were actually pretty motivated to get down there and be a part of the deployment. So did a Unitas, then did my B billet, went to MCRD San Diego, did the normal 3 years there. Went out to Oklahoma for 6 months, went out to the Field Artillery Career Captain's Course. Was one of the few Marine grunts that had the opportunity to go out and do that during that time. Learned about artillery, fire support for 6 months. You know, got a great education from that school. And then from there, went and checked into 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, deployed with the 15th MEU. I had the H&S company under the BLT for that deployment. And that deployment was extremely dynamic. We did a little bit of everything. The big tsunami back in 2004, 2005 hit Indonesia and Sri Lanka. So we went and did tsunami relief, which is something I'll never forget. Then went and did counter piracy operations in the Arabian Gulf. Then went into Iraq, and we're on the ground in Iraq for about 2.5 months. Got back on the ship. This was the ill-fated Bonhomme Richard, you know, the ship that just suffered that terrible yard fire, you know, last year. Yeah. And so got back on the, you know, the big number 6, and we were slated to go home. And then one night we felt the ship make a right turn, and we were heading south, and we knew that we had changed direction, and, you know, got spun up to go into Somalia. And at the last second, that mission was cut off for reasons that were never explained to us. So then we took a left turn and started heading towards India, and finished up the deployment with some nice libo in Australia and Hawaii. And then got back home to Camp Pendleton. And then 6 months later, I was on a plane heading back to Camp Fallujah, where I had Weapons Company 1-1, where we were reconfigured as a mobile assault company. Got back, and let me know. It's telling me my internet connection is unstable. So
yeah, the last thing I heard was that you had just gotten to Fallujah.
Okay, all right. So let me my signal here. Hold on. Give me a minute. Bear with me here. I'm gonna try to see if it works better off my I apologize.
It's all right, sir.
Okay.
Can
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you now, sir. It's the nature of the beast.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to leave it alone for now, and then if I continue to have some issues, I might try to transition over to my hotspot. Kind of go from there.
Okay, understood, sir.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, operated out of primarily around Karma, the town of Karma, northeast of Fallujah, northeast of Camp Fallujah. Operated there for 7 months.
And what year was this, sir?
That would have been 2005 to 2006. So the 15th MU deployment overlapped between 2004 and 2005. That deployment with 1-1 overlapped between 2005 2006. So cut my teeth there as the company commander on the ground, and then came back and volunteered to be the regimental headquarters company commander. Did that for a year for 1st Marines. So I pretty much spent all my time in the fleet as a captain in company command. I had 3 different company commands back to back. So an H&S company on a deployment, a weapons company on a deployment, and then the headquarters company back in Camp Horno. From there, went to the basic school to teach lieutenants. First year there, operations officer. Second year, had the opportunity to be what they used to call the maneuver section head. So I was in charge of all the actual exercises that the lieutenants run through when they go through the basic officer course. And in my 3rd year there, I got to be a company commander twice with both Alpha and Charlie companies, which was, a great experience. After that, went out to the stumps. 29 Palms was the XO-27 for a year. Then got the surprise of my life. Literally 96 hours before the BLT was going to deploy to Okinawa to be a part of the 31st MU. They were doing MUs from the desert during that time. Got told by the regimental commander, General Renforth, tapped me on the shoulder, said, "Hey, 3-7 is going back to Afghanistan. 3-7 is woefully short personnel and experienced officers. You've done a great job as an XO. But I need you to go to 3-7 and you're going to go to Afghanistan." So watched 2-7 get on the buses and go off to March Air Force Base, and then immediately checked into 3-7 to take over their advisor team. Served in that role for a year, deployed with them to Afghanistan, and then came back and was the XO for 3-7 for a few months. Until the Marine Corps figured out what they wanted to do for me or do with me. Got selected for lieutenant colonel while I was out in the desert. And so they had me help stand up a logistics school out there called McLaug, which was right next door to the Marine Corps Tactical Operations Group, which had been stood up a few years prior to that. So the logistics community got there. So I was a lone grunt at McLaug for a year, helping get that school stood up, which was also an amazing experience. From there, came back east again to the Expeditionary Warfare School as a major. Worked there for 3 years. Was a division head. Was the chief of curriculum, and then was the deputy director. So those are my 3 roles there. While at EWS. And also while at TBS, and I didn't mention this before, TAD all over the world. One of the things that, we do quite a bit in the Marine Corps that doesn't get enough attention is, we're consistently trying to help other militaries from around the world and our sister services either improve upon or get their their own PME up and running. So that was something I did quite a bit. So, I traveled pretty extensively even during those 2B billets at the basic school and at EWS, going and taking a look at how other people did their training, trying to help the Afghans again and the Iraqis, stand up their schools and that sort of thing. So did quite a bit of that in both those roles, both as a major and lieutenant colonel, both the basic school and EWS. So I think if you added up all the time I spent TAD in the Marine Corps, it probably would equate to more, if not more time than I actually spent deployed. So yeah, one of my big regrets in life is that I didn't keep track of all my frequent flyer miles, because it would be pretty extensive. So
yeah.
But then got another surprise. One of my mentors and former bosses, now Major General Furness, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Hey, need a man of your talent and experience to come up to legislative affairs." So for 4 years, I did legislative affairs for the Marine Corps. Timing wise, it fit in well. Unfortunately, I was going through divorce. So deferred the opportunity for command as a result, because, I had to make the strategic decision to stay close to home and stay close to my kids through the divorce process. And, a divorce is not something I would wish on anyone. But those of your listeners who've been through it, they particularly the dads, understand. And it's not easy on the ladies either. And I don't want to imply that it is, but it's a terrible process, and it's hard on kids if you have kids. And at that point, I realized that even if I had gotten command, my ability to concentrate on, for 2 years and give that the focus that it. That's my girlfriend's son coming to say hi. He just came back from his dad's, and so, hey buddy, how's it going? Hey, how's it going? All right. Okay. All right. Let me finish this up. Okay. Then I'll play with you. All right. So, made the decision to defer command and stay in the National Capital Region. I knew that meant that I was not going to go any further in the Marine Corps, that I was, in the infantry career track. If you don't take command, it's almost impossible to make colonel. But at the end of the day, with the amount of time I'd already spent away from my kids, having the opportunity to be close to them while going through that process, for me, it was just the right decision to make. So, but got the opportunity to spend an extended amount of time in legislative affairs as a result. Did 4 years in that billet. Did a little bit of everything there. Spent 2 years on Capitol Hill and 2 years in the Pentagon. So I got to see how things are run at the strategic level in terms of congressional engagement from a uniform perspective, but also got to be directly embedded with Congress, both as a liaison and as a fellow, and had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall, really, because there were just periods of time working with Congress that I was just Alex and nobody knew I was a Marine. They just thought I was a regular Hill staffer, which was awesome. Because you got to see how the process really works, at least on the congressional side, in terms of the tough decisions they have to make and all the compromises they have to make trying to get legislation done, which is exactly what the founding fathers wanted. And it was eye-opening experience, an experience I wish more Americans got the chance to see, because we live in a time of political polarity. But what I would tell folks is that the vast majority of representatives and senators, whether they be Democrat or Republican, just get up every day and try to do the best they can for the people who elected them. And that often gets lost in all the rancor. They also, the vast majority of them are really good friends. And that was something that I thought it was unfortunate that we don't get to see that aspect of it, to see two people who are diametrically opposed politically be the best of friends. Yeah. And that's something, again, I really wish more Americans got to see especially right now.
Mm.
Finished up my career with the safety division. As traditionally what happens when you get an opportunity to do a fellowship is you give the Marine Corps a 2-year payback. Because of my seniority, I didn't have to do that. I could have retired out of legislative affairs, but in good faith, I said, hey, you guys hooked me up with an incredible opportunity. Let me do what I'm supposed to do with this and take that knowledge back and use it strategically for the Marine Corps for 2 years, as any other fellow would. Didn't quite get the orders that I expected to be tied back to that experience, but got to do something rewarding nonetheless, and that's be the chief of ground safety for 2 years. And also got to do a joint job where I was the chairman of the Joint Tactical Vehicle Safety Working Group. Again, another billet that before COVID required an extensive amount of travel, there was a lot of goodness in that as well. So, so that's how I finished out my career. Retired, or had my retirement ceremony on May 7th. Went on terminal leave and then officially retired on August 1st. And like I said, working through the challenges that come with the initial transition. Just landed an incredible job opportunity, so I'm very excited about that. And eager to get going on my second career. So that's my career in a nutshell. Maybe not as been all over the world multiple times.
That's awesome.
Like I said, got to see the Marine Corps in 3 distinct phases. That pre 9/11 Marine Corps, 18 months between deployments traditionally, UDPs, MEWs, unit tosses, Marcots, all the rest of that stuff we used to do back in the day before the towers came down. Then got to see the Marine Corps go to war. Then got to see on the back end of my career, the Marine Corps transition away from what we had been doing out in the desert and in Central Asia and refocus on our traditional roles. And seeing it from a safety perspective was also pretty fascinating because, again, you get to see the entire enterprise and how it works and sometimes doesn't work. So that was, I had a great career, proud of my career. I made some poor personal decisions as a young man, but got 2 beautiful kids out of the deal. And, you make grown-up decisions, they have grown-up consequences. So didn't get a chance to pin on Colonel, but that was, again, a decision that I made that was said, hey, you only get to be a dad once. One of the things I remember very distinctly when I was a young lieutenant, I got mentored by a captain who had recently got out after 8 years. And I asked him, hey, why did you get out? And he said, hey, the Marine Corps kicks everybody out at some point. Even the mighty commandant gets tapped on the shoulder and gets told it's time to leave. But you only get to be a family man once. The Marine Corps is a train. It's going to keep on rolling. And if you don't take care of your priorities, by the time the Marine Corps kicks you off the train, you're going to find you don't have a whole lot left. And so that advice resonated with me. And when it came time to make a decision between the next promotion and being a good dad under some very tough circumstances, for me, it was an easy decision. So,
yeah. So one of the questions that I think I want to ask you is, so on my show, I've talked a lot about like alcoholism and stuff like that. Like I've never, is that something that because you've seen it from the top down and
Sure.
and also you've probably seen it laterally as well.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that? Because is it something that maybe you've dealt with at all? And then how did you get through it? And then also, what are your thoughts on how we can help those younger Marines get through it?
Well, let me, I have a unfortunately not on a more personal level, but I have a lot of experience with substance abuse and people who have dealt with it. My father was an alcoholic. He, the bottle is what eventually beat him, at the end of the day. And then he was a functioning alcoholic. I didn't even know he had a drinking problem until I was an adult. And he, as a dad, did a very good job. His kids, my mom knew, and people who knew him well knew that he had a drinking problem. which again, I did not discover until I was older. And then the severity of his, sorry if I'm coming in unstable again. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you, sir.
Okay. So dealing with that, and as a young adult, young officer, and then seeing my father struggle through that, which is, I idolized my dad. So seeing him deal with addiction was something that was really hard, while I was also dealing with my own issues and own post-deployment demons. And what I found out from talking to him was that a lot of his problems were unresolved issues from his time in Vietnam. So, with veterans now and service members now, even though we could always do better, there's a lot of support that we offer for, our servicemen and women who come back from deployment and who are struggling with what they dealt with and what they saw. Previous generations, it was, hey, welcome home, get a job, man up, deal with it and move forward. But their only support network was each other. And with the Vietnam vets, it was particularly hard because they didn't come back as units. They came back as individuals. And so my dad's first deployment to Vietnam, he was a draftee. So he, went into the Army as an individual, came out of the Army as an individual. The Army was like, hey, thanks for your service. Kicked him back down to, a segregated South. So he's dealing, that was when all his problems really started with alcohol. And this was as a young man back in the, late 1960s, long before I came along, long before he even met my mom. Struggled, rejoined the Army on the promise that he would not be sent back to Vietnam, and then got sent back to Vietnam. So, which again, went through the same thing. When as an individual, came back as an individual. So that whole support network of, previous veterans, maybe they come home as a unit or come home in groups or come home in cohorts. The Vietnam vets didn't have that. And so that was, why so many of them, I think, kind of struggled, was because, they went in time straight from the battlefield to back home. The movie, even though it's sensationalized, the old movie, The Deer Hunter, with Robert De Niro, and kind of illustrates that, where they would literally go from the battlefield and then be home, a week later. And with no transition, no, hey, thanks for your service, here's your DD-214, good luck, and so that was tough, and so I think that's where the genesis of his drinking problem. I had a platoon sergeant, my second platoon sergeant, had a severe drinking problem, and was in denial about it. Ended up, he was my platoon sergeant when we deployed to South America. Got so out of control, we had to send him home, because he immediately needed, level 3 inpatient treatment. Yeah, he was, and the thing that was sad about him, there were a lot of things that were sad about him, but when he was sober, he was probably one of the best staff NCOs in the 24 years that I came across. I mean, he was on it. The problem was he was only sober about 50% of the times towards the end of the deployment. And so I have seen people both in uniform and out of uniform my entire life struggle with various forms of addiction and alcoholism. So, the key is, the key is, in my opinion, for those individuals, is that from my experience in helping with those folks, is making sure that they know that they've got people who care about them and who support them and who, understand, like, hey, it's, you can't stress enough to people in that situation that there's no shame in getting help.
Yeah.
And what I have told Marines and sailors and other people in that same situation, if you came to work with a broken arm, and I could see that your arm was broken, visibly broken, we'll take you to the hospital and we get it mended. There'd be no shame in that. Whether it comes to PTSD or any form of mental illness or any form of addiction, my what I always told my people was like, what's the difference? What's the difference between the broken arm and the fact that you have a substance abuse issue? There's no difference really. You go, you get treatment, we help you, and you move on. And the last thing, if you came in my office with a broken arm and I could see that your arm was broken, I'm not just going to shrug my shoulders and go, well, don't be a pussy, deal with it. You know what I mean? Like I'd be like, what the hell are you doing here? Like, you need to go to the hospital.
Right.
You go to the hospital and get help, and then however long it takes for your arm to heal is however long it takes. But the priority is your health. And so, whenever I counseled individuals who were dealing with various issues, I'd be like, to me, it's no different. It's no different than if you came to me with a broken arm. I don't see it any different. Now, in terms of any stigmas that might exist or whatever, so what? Like, go get yourself healthy. That's number one. You're a young man or a young woman. Go get yourself healthy. In the case of my dad, the same thing. Old man or old woman. It's like, dad, you got grandkids you want to see grow up. You've got, you want to be there for all those milestones that are still yet to come, and people want to hear, so, if you need help, go get help. And, and I think that's the key in my experience for those folks is they have to understand that there are people that are there to support them without shame. And that I think is absolutely critical, because I think if you've got that, hey, thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. Just brought me a watch. He wants to make sure I don't lose track of time. So, but in my experience, it's critical particularly as leaders, particularly for us as leaders, as officers and staff NCOs, is to pull those people in and say, hey, there's no shame. It's like, you're hurt. It happens. Everybody gets hurt in this job. The Marine Corps has a 100% injury rate. Some of us are hurt physically. Some of us are hurt mentally. Some of us bring baggage with us that the stress of this job exposes. Bottom line is that you're hurt. Man, it's okay. If you were in a firefight and got shot, nobody'd be like, rub some dirt on it. Like, no, we'd get you to the hospital and we'd fix you. So that to me is critical, is sitting those people down kneecap to kneecap and making sure they understand, like, listen, I don't think any less of you because you have a substance abuse issue. I don't think any less of you because you have PTSD. You're hurt. All of us get hurt in this business. It's one of the things that makes it at times kind of crazy to think about. There are Marines who go through 20 years in the Marine Corps, never see combat, who still walk away with issues. It is a tough job. You get up every day and you ask your body to do things that the human body was not designed to do. You put yourself through things mentally that we were not designed to withstand, and we do it voluntarily. And then when you add in the specter of combat, it just exacerbates that. And so, for me, from my perspective and my leadership style, that was always the tack that I took with people who were dealing with various issues with those injuries that you can't see. Is just that, you treat them the same. And when I mentored, my young officers that came up with me and staff NCOs that came up with me, that was always my pitch to say, hey, that's part of the reason why people sometimes are so reluctant to ask for help, is because we treat different medical issues. We tend to put them in different categories in terms of how much we care. And I would always just use the broken arm analogy to be like, hey, any one of you comes in here with your bone sticking through your arm, none of us are going to think any less of you if you decide to go to the hospital and get fixed. So that was kind of the way that I attacked that problem.
So I have a friend of mine. I told him I was doing this interview, and he he wrote a good question for you, so I'm just gonna
Okay.
read it. I'm just gonna read it because I want to I don't want to misinterpret it the way he wrote it. So his
Sure.
question is your opinion or your perspective on orders down the ranks, your expectation versus reality. Has there ever been a time where you gave an order and it wasn't delegated the way that you wanted it to, or the way that you wanted things to be taken care of, the outcome wasn't the right way? Did they meet your expectations, or were you at all surprised or impressed in some instances by the Marines and their adaptability to accomplish your orders?
Sure. The answer to that question would be yes to both ends of the spectrum. There were times, particularly as a company grade officer, where you make an order and make a decision, and it didn't get executed to the level that you expected. And then there were definitely other times where the Marines just completely blew me away in terms of what they were able to come up with and what they were able to develop, just based solely on intent. So what I would say, and that in my experience, a lot of it, I gained an appreciation early on for the importance of corporals. And if you were to ask me as a lieutenant, especially as a lieutenant, what rank is the most important in the Marine Corps, I would have told you without hesitation, corporals. I learned really fast. I could have great lance corporals and PFCs. I could have great sergeants. I could have great platoon sergeants. And one of the things that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, we've gotten a lot better at it, particularly in the infantry, was, can you hear me?
Yeah, I hear you, sir.
One of the things I learned very quickly was usually whenever there was a breakdown in execution, it usually happened at the corporal level. Conversely, whenever we usually knocked it out of the park, it was usually because of the corporals, so that was, I was blessed. The vast majority of my staff NCOs throughout my career were excellent. The vast majority of my sergeants were pretty good. And I was blessed. I also had good Marines. You have your bottom 10%, you had your guys and gals who created some challenges. But corporal for me is really where I learned very quickly where the rubber met the road. If you had strong corporals, it was very little you couldn't do as a platoon commander and as a company commander.
So in your time, I know one of the things that you wanted to talk about, sir, was the burden of leadership. What
Sure.
did you mean specifically by that? Like, what did you mean by that?
Yeah, it's something that nobody prepares you for. Command in combat can be extremely lonely. Nobody prepares you for the moment where somebody dies following your orders. There's no class for it. There's no training for it. When you're sitting down behind that laptop, writing that condolence letter to that family, or making that phone call, and then the gravity of it hits you. There's nothing that prepares you for that. And you can tell yourself, and you can have other people tell you, hey, it's just war. You made the right decision. It was just that individual's day. So on and so forth. Things that you know rationally in the back of your mind are true. At least for me, and I know every commander faces it differently. There's a part of you that never gets over that. And I can tell you that there were many times where just the gravity of it, of company command in particular, which is, my combat experience was both company command and as an advisor team leader in Afghanistan. Having to make tough decisions that you knew were vital to accomplishing the mission, but that you also knew would likely result or potentially result in people getting hurt. And you also knew that no amount of planning, no amount of detail, no amount of discipline, while all those things were important in terms of mitigating the possibility that you were going to lose folks. At the end of the day, you knew that the law of averages were going to catch up to you at some point. The enemy always has a vote. And in both Iraq and Afghanistan, we were dealing with a very creative enemy that that wasn't static. And there's that old, for professionals in the military, complaints go up, they don't go down. So, your role as a commander is to be the rock that everybody else looks up to, especially when things aren't going well. But you don't have anybody else to lean on, except for the guy that's looking back at you in the mirror. And you can confide in your staff NCOs, like I confided. I was lucky particularly as a weapons company commander. I had both a first sergeant and operations chief. So I had, a master sergeant and first sergeant, working with me, both great staff NCOs. But even still, as a commander, there's only so much, venting that you can do. And so you end up trying to find ways to cope with the stress yourself, but also making sure that no one else sees you sweat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that was a question I was going to ask you, because that's got to be it. Because if you're down in the dumps, or if you're reflecting that to your subordinates, then they're going to see that, especially while being out in theater. And I'm assuming, or I want to ask you, so do you still deal with that? Is there times where you look back at it and you still
absolutely
argue with yourself? Could I have made a different decision? Could I have done something different?
Every day. And I don't say that as, it's not hyperbole. There isn't a day that doesn't go by, and probably will never be another day that doesn't go by where I don't think about a decision that I made, and second guess myself in terms of what could I have done differently, and would the results have been different. I didn't, and again, I'm not downplaying the PTSD. Again, everybody who goes through combat or suffers any sort of traumatic event, all of us are hardwired differently. Mm-hmm. So I never, suffered from traditional PTSD as a result of my experiences in combat. But I will tell you that I had, for a period of time, almost crippling survivor's guilt. And I took the loss of each one of my Marines personally. I blame myself for a long time. And it took about 5 years before I stopped feeling personally responsible for the deaths of each of the Marines that I lost. But yeah, there isn't a day that doesn't go by where I don't think about those Marines. I don't think about the decisions that were made and what I could have done better or differently as a commander that may have changed the results of how that turned out.
So what advice do you have for those leaders who now may be in your shoes? Sure. And or yourself? If you could, I know we clearly can't go back.
Yeah.
But like you said, there is no, you can read books, you can, sure, read documentaries, but you're not going to learn it till you live it. But what are some maybe words or some advice that you could share with us, maybe to help someone if they are ever in those shoes where they have to be the one to make those decisions and make those hard calls?
Sure. Yeah. Number one, the number one thing I would tell any of those officers is don't be afraid to make the hard calls. That's number one. You know, the nature of our business is brutal. When you strip off the veneer, you know, you strip off the great looking dress blues and the bumper sticker slogans and all the recruiting commercials. At the end of the day, especially in the combat arms community, I mean, our job is to go places and kill people. And at times it can be horrible. The people you're fighting against, they're going to try to kill you, and sometimes they're going to succeed. But the first thing I would tell them is don't be afraid to make the hard call. That's number one, because the one thing you can never lose sight of is that the number one way that you're going to keep people alive is do everything you can to shorten the conflict. So, winning is one of the most surefire ways to make sure that you keep as many people alive as possible. So every decision you make has got to be with that in mind in terms of achieving the objective, whatever objectives you're giving, and doing so as quickly and efficiently as possible, because that's ultimately the most effective way to save lives. And you can use sight of that. Once you become risk averse and you start building your plans around, hey, I want to try to build this plan in such a way as to where I make it as quote unquote safe as possible, you're probably going to get more people hurt that way than as opposed to focusing on the enemy and doing what you need to do to achieve your objectives, and then making it as efficient as you possibly can, but understanding that people are going to have to assume risk. The other thing that I would tell anybody in that position, and this is something that I learned, is that whatever pain you're feeling as a commander is nothing compared to the pain that Marine's peers are feeling. So, the guilt that I felt with the death of each of those Marines was nothing compared to the guilt and pain that the Marines who were on his left and right felt. And so
why do you feel that way, sir?
Because it's more personal for them. I knew my Marines pretty well. I didn't know them anywhere near as well as the guys that partied with them every weekend or slept next to them, right? There's no way I could have known them as well as they knew them, and formed those types of friendships. So you have to make it clear as a commander, particularly as a commander, because remember, the vast majority of our Marines, they don't make it a career, they get out, they go do other things. So you have to make it clear that your responsibility to them as a commander never ends. The guys that I went to Iraq and Afghanistan with, I've made it clear, and I was like, hey, I will always be your commander, in the sense that whenever you need anything, whenever you're having a bad day or struggling with something that we experienced, when I say that my email and my phone is always available, now with social media even more so, don't hesitate. And I think it's important to make that clear, to be like, listen, don't ever feel like you are going through anything alone. I'm always up for the 3 o'clock phone call, for somebody who is struggling, because I would much rather, we have terrible suicide rates with our veterans, in particular our combat veterans. And so I was like, listen, I'd much rather you wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning, even if I've got to talk you off a ledge someplace, than read your obituary, So, and I also think that that's cathartic and what I have found is that can be very cathartic for me, in terms of having to remember and take a step back and be like, hey, listen, you got it right most of the time. The vast majority of the Marines that you took into combat came back in one piece and have gone on to do, either have their own successful Marine Corps careers or gone off and done other things in life and been successful. A few have struggled, but the vast majority of us now are at a place where we're doing pretty well. And so it's also good to remind yourself of that, to say like, hey, yeah, you can go back and second guess yourself every day for the rest of your life, but remember, the vast majority of the time you got it right. The other thing I would tell them is that it's okay, like I would tell anybody else, to ask for help if you need it. I was good at getting poor job of taking care of them. Probably the three things I would apologize again, my connection's unstable. But those would be the three things that I would tell somebody in terms of, hey, it's gonna happen. You know, if you take Marines and sailors into combat, no matter how good of a job you do, you're not gonna bring everybody back. You know, and I had I'll be honest with you, I went to combat under the illusion that I was going to bring everybody back. And the first time I lost a Marine, there was a part of me that just didn't want to believe it had happened. And I distinctly remembered, and it was one of the most selfish thoughts I ever had. And I feel guilty about it to this day. But I remember thinking, how could this happen to me? You know, like like this, how could this happen? How could I lose a Marine? Like, how could this happen? This wasn't supposed to happen. That was the next thought that kind of popped in my head. And it was just like, listen, I had to kind of like have a conversation with myself. Hey, listen, moron, like, you're at war. It wasn't, it's not, this is the two-way shooting range. It's like, you're at war. But there was definitely that, I would definitely tell anybody, as naive as it may sound, as silly as it may sound to people, I fully expected as a company commander to bring everyone home, and was shocked when I didn't. And I think that's part of the reason why I took it so personal that I didn't, because I had put that burden on myself that I was going to bring everybody back. But the enemy has a vote. And that's something that you can't, they get up every day with their own plans. And no matter how good you are, again, good discipline. Making, paying attention to very small details. General Mattis had the signs all over Camp Fallujah, complacency kills. Reminding people of that all the time, having to be an absolute flaming asshole the last 90 days of the deployment, staying on top of people for making sure they put their helmets on. If they move the vehicle 3 feet, like, put your helmet and your flak on. Just those little things that you had to stay on top of. Staying on top of my lieutenants to make sure they didn't get staying on top of the Marines, staying on top of staff and shields. Doing those things that make you very unpopular in the moment. Those little things that you have to do in order to keep people alive. And then understanding that even when you're doing all that, the enemy still has a vote, and some days you're not going to get the results that you want. Be honest to the families. Families are going to have questions. The moms never get over it. You have to be prepared for that. I was very open with the families. I stayed connected with the families. I did that deliberately. I'm very good friends with the one of the Marines we lost. His mom and I've gotten close over the years. But I would tell you, whenever his birthday rolls around or the anniversary of the day that he was killed, she really relives it every time. And going on 20 years later, it's just as devastating for her every year as it was when it happened, the day that it happened. And it is again, it's going to sound selfish, but it's one of the most helpless feelings that I have every year is I never know what to say other than I'm sorry, because I know that there's no amount of poetry that's going to flow from my lips that's going to assuage what she's feeling as a mom. The families never get over it. Those Gold Star families, they never get over it. They, and I would tell you that I would trade every promotion, every medal, every accolade that I ever received in 24 years. I would trade it all for those kids back in a heartbeat. I would gladly walk away from the Marine Corps as the worst officer that ever wore a Marine Corps uniform if it meant that those Marines would be brought back to life. But that's a fantasy. They're not coming back. And there's a great old movie with a great actor called named Gregory Peck. It's called 12 O'Clock High. And in the movie, Gregory Peck is a brigadier general who's sent to clean up a bomber group which is underperforming in World War II. And the guy that he replaced had become risk averse. He had become more concerned with doing things that help keep his crews alive as opposed to accomplishing the mission. And so Gregory Peck's character has to come in and clean up the bomber group and get them back to where they needed to be so they were performing. And so by making them a better squadron, he actually saved a lot of lives, but the losses of each one of those bomber crews eventually chipped away at it, because he was exactly that kind of officer where he was wearing the brave face throughout the majority of the movie, but a little at a time, it was, every loss eroded him a little bit. And they get to the last mission where he basically suffers a nervous breakdown and he can't fly. And the officer that he had to relieve, who he had taken under his wing, basically assumes command of the bomber group. They go off and run an excellent mission. And one of the final scenes shows Gregory Peck, sitting there basically almost in a catatonic state, and he hears his bomber group coming back to wake up. And so one of the officers, who was like, they called him the ground exec, Gregory Peck's character says, "Hey, how many did we lose?" He's like, "We didn't lose any today. Like, they all made it back, and it was because of you." And so what I would tell any commander is that everybody handles you, but how we all handle it is different. But ultimately, the way that you're going to succeed is by having and keep the majority of your folks alive is by having the best trained unit and the best disciplined unit that you can build within the time and resources that are available. And if you're doing that, even with the losses that you take, if you know in your heart of hearts that you did the best you could with the resources and time you had available, you can walk away even with the pain of the losses, knowing that you did everything you could within your power to get that unit to the level that it needed to be successful in combat. And that's the best advice that I could give any young officer or staff NCO heading into that situation. But it is lonely. It is lonely. And you just need to be prepared for that.
Was there any, you mentioned the movie, was there any books that you read at all that helped you kind of help with your decision making or help grow you as an individual, as an officer, sir?
From that movie.
No, any other books or any other things that you've used in your time to help grow as an officer when it comes to decision making and leadership tactics?
Oh wow. Yeah, I'm trying to. I read so much. One of the things that I would tell anybody who decides to make the Marine Corps profession, whether enlisted or officers, you have to become a student of your profession, and remember that very few of the things that we experience, especially in the combat arms, haven't already happened to other people. So pick up a book, read it, listen to it. I've become a big fan of audiobooks here recently. Put it down and pick up another one. In terms of books that I read, that I tell you, people used to laugh at me when I said this, but there's this kind of cheesy old movie about the Civil War, about Gettysburg. And again, I'm relating back to a movie scene, but there's a point to it. On the third day at Gettysburg, you have Pickett's charge. Now, most people look at the third day from the Confederate perspective in terms of the decision made by Lee on the third day to attack the Union center. Longstreet disagreeing with him, Pickett not being probably the best person to have led the charge, so on and so forth. What this movie did, though, is it gave the perspective briefly from the Union side. And there was a commander there, can't remember his name. It might have been, I'm not going to guess. I can see his face, but can't remember his name. But he was the brigade commander of what they call the Iron Brigade. And it was this famous unit within the Union Army. It had a reputation for extraordinary toughness, and they had an extraordinarily tough commander. And there was a scene that I recalled many times, even in combat, believe it or not, where he's on his horse. The brigade commander is on his horse. And his aide basically runs him and says, "Hey, sir, please get off the horse. If anything happens to you, the brigade isn't going to be able to function." And, the Union Army is absorbing this attack. It's unexpected. They were weak in the center, but they knew that they couldn't break. And the brigade commander very calmly looks down and says, "Hey, there are times when a brigade commander's life doesn't matter." And he says it calmly. He's on his horse. He's riding back and forth. And he did it more than anything just to inspire his soldiers at the worst possible time to say, "Hey, I'm here with you, and I'm willing to assume all the same risk that you are. I know the enemy can see me on this horse. I know they know who I am. I'm not running away from that. I'm here with you right now. Heart's not skipping a beat." And I always looked at that little scene as an example of what leadership in combat really is about. It's about those moments where your soldiers, your Marines, whoever, have got to be able to look up at you as a commander and know that you are facing all the same level of danger they are, and you are cool, calm, and collected. If it's my moment, then it's my moment, but I'm going to die on my feet next to my Marines, leading them in the most calm and professional manner possible. And so when I found myself in that situation, I would always, in those moments where I'd tell myself, when the bullets were flying and the IEDs were going off, I'd be like, I don't want to be here right now. I would always think about the commander of the Iron Brigade in the center at Gettysburg and what he told his aide. And that was kind of my internal motto in terms of what I tried to emulate as an officer in those situations where we were having some days that, things sometimes weren't going so well.
What do you so now looking back at everything and just looking forward, how do you see your time in the Marine Corps? How did it prepare you for what's to come, for your next career, for your future?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, I love people. and leadership is leadership. I'm blessed in this opportunity that I have coming up now. Very similar to a company command kind of situation. I'm going to have other, lieutenants, for lack of a better term, working for me, and they're going to have their teams working for them, and then I'm going to have the equivalent of a battalion commander above me. So it's going to be very similar in terms of how it's structured to company command. So that's something that's very comfortable for me. Dealing with chaos and unpredictability. There's nothing more chaotic and unpredictable than a battlefield. So having had that experience, I've told people many times, my definition of a bad day and your definition of a bad day are completely different. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I was one of the older people working in the office, when I had a chance to be a fellow. I was actually about 20 years older than most of the people in the office. And I can't remember what it was. There was something bad that happened that day, and morale in the office was a little bit low. Maybe we had a bill that didn't pass or something like that. But it meant we were going to have to stay and work pretty late. And I remember one of the young staffers was like, "Hey, Alex, are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah." I was like, "I'm not sleeping on the ground in the rain and no one's trying to kill me." It's like, "I'm okay." So I think having had those experiences, having endured some things and having endured some hardship, times I can look back throughout my career and point to those moments where I was like, I shouldn't have survived that moment. I should be, 6 feet underground, buried 95 at Arlington. It gives you that perspective. So, heading into a civilian role, while I'm certainly not going to downplay the challenges that come with, civilian leadership and the corporate world, I don't want to go in and be arrogant and cocky and be like, this whole civilian thing is going to be a cakewalk compared to what I just did the past 24 years. Because if I go into it with that mindset, then I'll fall flat on my face. But I'm able to keep things in perspective and be like, okay, I've led some tough type A personalities, and I've been in some of the some harrowing situations and some confusing situations, and I think that mental preparedness, being formally trained how to plan, how to do detailed planning, but also at the same token, understand that one of the first things you learn as a planner is that your plan is going to change at some point, and you have to have the flexibility to not fall in love with that plan and deal with the changes as they come up. So there's that flexibility that's inherent. So,
sir, I don't know how you feel about answering this, but I just want to see what your thoughts are. Sure. Just like you just said, you go into, you plan all this stuff out, you go through all the different wickets, you go through all the hours and days of planning a mission, and then it comes to the day where it's happening, and you're like you said, it's gonna, sometimes things are gonna go south. What do you do in that moment? Like, how do you, number one, like, what are the feelings going through your mind, through your body? Like, is there a specific thought that you have, like, looking
Sure.
back? Is there a time maybe you can talk us through that?
Sure. Generally speaking, there's a millisecond of frustration because you just put all this time and effort into building a plan, and then fill in the blank. The weather, the enemy, the Marine Corps, sometimes a combination of all three, decided, we see your plan and we've changed things. And so there's that initial frustration because you just spent all that time planning. But then there's, okay, let's get over it. And let's take what we've planned as a baseline and see how we need to deviate from it. And so that's one of the things when, I've taught planning, like I said, for 14 years. And I was like, hey, that's one of the things, that's the importance of planning. Events on the ground are going to change. Events on the periphery are going to change that you have no control over. You have to be prepared for that mentally. And then, but the beautiful thing about having a plan is that you're not starting over from scratch. You're just alternating a deviation of the plan. And if you've been looking at the problem the right way, unless you were looking at the problem completely the wrong way, even the curveballs should be something you're able to adjust to, you know, not easily, but you should be able to adjust to that. But I would always tell you, I mean, again, not always practicing what I preach, that whenever that happened, there was always sort of that initial, like, you know, like, you know, because you put a lot of work into those plans. And so you wouldn't be human if there wasn't that initial kind of like son of a bee, you know, moment. But then you have to put it behind you and focus on what's next.
Okay. And so the last thing that I would kind of just ask you is just throughout everything, throughout all of this, what is your advice on just decision making in general? Like, what is your like, how do you go about decision making? And especially when you don't have the time, and sometimes it has to be like, oh, okay, right now on the fly, like we're gonna go do this. And then
here's what I would tell anybody, and this is what I learned early on: trust your instincts. That little voice in your head, that intuition, is right 9 out of 10 times. We as human beings, particularly in the Western world or modern world, the instinctive intuition that we carry around as human beings has been honed over millions of years. So our survival mechanisms that we carry around, when that little voice in your head says, hey, you know, it's, for instance, when you meet someone who just gives you a bad vibe, you can't put your finger on it. You can't. But you know that there's just something about that person that isn't right. If you think about it, throughout the majority of your life, 8 out of 10 times, that little voice that was like something about this person isn't right, that voice in your head was right about that person. You may not have been able to put your finger on it, but there was something that just, those alarm bells started going off like, hey, you know, and those alarm bells are millions of years of DNA and hard lesson learned that have been ingrained in your psyche. When you're a young commander, or hell, an old commander, and you see something and there, you know, that little voice in your head is like, you know, that little voice in your head is like, hey, I think we need to take a left turn here. You know, trust your instincts. When you don't have time for deliberate planning, when you don't have time for, you know, so on and so forth, number one, trust your instincts. Alex. Number two, hey, buddy. Okay, I'm almost done. Number two, if you do have time, listen to people. Listen to, you know, listen to your NCOs and staff NCOs, because they have a gut instinct too, in terms of what's going on. They have their own experiences. So if you have time to have a huddle and take in some additional input, then do that and see what other people think. If you don't, and you have to make a decision based on like, hey, we don't have time for a committee, there's no time for deliberate planning, I have to make a decision right now and then stand by it, trust your instincts. Those instincts are right the majority of the time.
Was there ever, do you have any thoughts right now of a time where your instinct was right? Like, is there anything maybe you can share with us where you're like, I remember this one time?
Oh, geez. It's hard. You know, I just went through this with the interview with the company that I'm working for. It was kind of a similar thing, but you have so many different examples. Sometimes it's hard to pull down specific examples. One of the gut instinct decisions I made that worked out well in the long run, for lack of a better term, you know, we just saw what happened in Afghanistan. We had what equated to a small coup attempt in the Kandak that we were, you know, the Afghan Army battalion that we were partnered with. And we had two factions within the unit that were about to come to blows. And I made a split decision to physically get between the factions. Definitely not by the book. The book says when that happens, you get out of the way and let the Afghans handle their business. But I had a sense that if things went kinetic between these two groups within the Kandak, then the whole thing was going to unravel. And so I made a split decision to just physically get between them, put the arms up, hey, you know, and probably not by the book the smartest decision, but it worked. You know, it got them to kind of like, you know, for the moment, de-escalate the situation. We were able to get Afghan leadership to come in, got everybody in a circle, and they, you know, they talked it out, they hugged it out, you know, and what could have been a bloodbath, you know, turned into a reconciliation. Hindsight, would I do it again? I don't know. But I know that my advisor team had done a lot of work to get us to where we were. And a lot of people had shed a lot of blood in that part of Afghanistan to get us where we were. And, you know, we were still sort of at a tipping point. And if something drastic wasn't done in that moment, I think we could have suffered an incident that was so catastrophic that we weren't going to recover from it. So that was an incident where I made a split decision, followed my gut, was able to help de-escalate the situation. A lot of other things happened, but that millisecond of me saying, whoa, 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 you know, so the international, calm down, fellas, you know, it, even if it was just for a millisecond, sort of deflected their attention away from each other. It was like, hey, you know, the gringo has gotten between us here, you know. It at least for a minute forced a change in the conversation.
Okay.
So that's an example that I mean, 24 years.
So
you know,
one
hundreds, you know.
Another question I would like to ask is just because I've had a lot of people ask me. I actually had someone ask me yesterday about it. And maybe coming from your standpoint, and especially because you've were through the whole entire thing, what are your, I don't want to say thoughts on it, but like, how do you feel about everything going on right now with us leaving Afghanistan? And I asked that only because, only because like I have a lot of friends of mine. I was at a wedding recently, and a friend that was at a wedding, and I deployed with both of the people at the wedding, and they both came up to me. We were having a couple of drinks, and they were like, they were upset about what had happened, and they felt like we were there for no reason, and a lot of people are feeling that way. So what are your thoughts on that? And
sure. And here's what I would tell all my fellow Afghan vets. We didn't go there for no reason. We went and did our jobs. You know, at the end of the day, our job was to facilitate the ability of the Afghan National Security Forces and the Afghan government to stand on their own 2 feet. We did that. You know, it's like, you know, it's like if you have a friend who, like we talked earlier in the beginning, who has a substance abuse issue, right? You make it clear to that individual, like, listen, I'm here for you and I'm willing to help. But there's a limit. There's a limit. At a certain point, you've got to be willing to look your friend or your relative in the eye and be like, listen, I've done everything I can for you. At some point, you've got to take the training wheels off and determine your own future. I empathize with you. You're in a tough situation. I empathize with the Afghans. They had their future stolen from them by the Soviets. You know, if you look at the old before and after pictures of Afghanistan in the late 70s, Afghanistan was on their way. You know, they had a chance of being a stable second world country with a decent standard of living. and, you know, nonstop war took that away from them. So I empathize with them to a certain degree to say, yeah, you got a raw deal. But we were there for 20 years. You know, I don't know about everybody else's experiences as an advisor, but I spent the majority of my time, as did my advisors in Afghanistan, convincing the Afghan National Security Forces to do their job. You know, I spent the majority of my time as an advisor in Afghanistan trying to get the Afghans to care about their country as much as I cared about their country. So from my point of view, I'd say to any Afghan vet, we did our job. We went over there, did what we were asked to do. In most cases, went above and beyond, but you can't make people care. The reason the Taliban won is not because they were better trained, better equipped, better people, better anything. They cared. That's why they won. Point blank in the story. It's the same thing in Vietnam. We did everything for the South Vietnamese military. On paper, the South Vietnamese military was better than the North Vietnamese military. The North Vietnamese won because they cared. The South Vietnamese did not. The only Afghans, honestly, and I know this sounds callous, but the only Afghans at the end of the day that I cared about were the ones who stuck out their necks to assist us, assist them. And I felt like it was an absolute travesty that we waited so long to get those people out. Those interpreters and all the other people behind the scenes that risked their lives to help the U.S. mission, you know, and did their part to really help Afghanistan stand on its own 2 feet. We should have got them out years ago. It should not have been a situation where at the last minute we're scrambling to rescue people and we had to be guilted into it. That was a travesty. We should have got all those folks out years ago and their families. They should have been gone. They should have been resettled in the West years ago. That's the part that bothers me. I can't give someone egg. I can lead by example. I can go out on every patrol. I can't make them care. So from my perspective, I will always be proud of what my advisors accomplished. But I'll tell anybody, when I got on that C-17, I got home, people asked me about Afghanistan. I was like, it's time to go. And I said that 10 years ago. And I say that as a Marine who was extremely proud of my service in Afghanistan. I would have told, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I'd be like, why are we still there? We can't make them care. I was like, the Taliban are going to win for one very simple reason. They give a damn. I mean, and that's how I feel. It's heartbreaking for the simple fact that in 20 years, they couldn't pick up the ball and run with it on their own. And I'm sorry, you give somebody 2 decades to get their stuff together, you're out of excuses. Now, did I like the way that we left? No, the way that we left was embarrassing. The lack of planning, the lack of detail, the surprise that, you know, things collapsed as quickly as they did. It's like, come on. That part, in terms of the execution, shameful. But there was no excuse for that shit show of a withdrawal. It should have been phased down over several months with a specific focus on getting the right people out, with enough ability left to do a real organized, proper withdrawal. So there was no excuse for the drama that we saw on TV and for any of that nonsense. There was no excuse for that. There was no excuse for that squad of Marines getting killed at the gate. No excuse for the haphazard, poorly planned way that happened. And I would tell you, you know, there's a lot of people that have a lot to answer for, both in uniform and out of uniform, for whatever the hell that was. But in terms of leaving Afghanistan, from a strategic standpoint, should have been done a decade ago.
So can I ask you another question, just because we just kind of got into it?
Sure.
Have you seen, I'm assuming you've seen what happened with Lieutenant Colonel Schumer, I think it is.
Yeah.
Is he right for what he's doing? Is he wrong for what he's doing?
Oh boy.
Like, what do you think now that you're out of the Marine Corps and you and you have, because you were and essentially at the same time,
sure.
What are your thoughts being the same rank as him, him throwing it on the line like that?
I respect him for having the courage of his convictions, of being willing to kind of put the rank on the table and say, hey, what the hell was that? And that we've gotten into this trend where in their collars or wearing a suit gets fired. We'll fire a battalion commander or a company commander for something that isn't their fault in a heartbeat, but we can have a goat rodeo of a withdrawal from Afghanistan. I haven't seen anyone get relieved. I haven't seen anyone get fired. I haven't seen anyone resign. So from that perspective, I can understand where he's coming from in terms of we've gotten in this trend where as you get above a certain rank, no matter how screwed up things become, you almost become untouchable as a result. I saw that from a safety perspective. There were definitely some circumstances I saw, and I'm not going to get into it here now, but where guys wearing stars on their collars should have been fired. It was the lieutenant colonel or the colonel or the captain or the lieutenant or the gunnery sergeant who got fired. And then it should have been a general who got fired. And so what he said in terms of his message, I agreed with. His method of going about it, here's the problem. We live in a news cycle where our attention span is about 48 hours. Again, respect him for having the courage of his convictions. He's not in the news anymore. America has already forgotten about Afghanistan and what happened 2 weeks ago. The only people still talking about Afghanistan are those Afghan vets who went there, who are still suffering from the emotional impacts of what they saw. And what we all experienced there. And I tell people, Afghanistan is not a place you can describe. You have to, if you weren't there, trying to tell people about the things you saw in Afghanistan is like, you're on another planet. The place is like no place I've ever been to. It's like stepping back to the 12th century. That's not an exaggeration. And you've been there, so you know what I'm talking about. They're coming back home from Afghanistan and trying to explain to people like the things you saw there. Some of it you can't make sense of.
Yeah.
And so we collectively, those of us who experienced that place, it still reverberates with us what happened a few weeks ago. The average American is back at the mall. So yeah, the lieutenant colonel, he took off the rank, he put it down. He's, we need to demand accountability. He's already yesterday's news. You want to affect change in the military? This is how you do it. You make the promise that when I'm the guy wearing those 2 or 3 stars, and when it's my turn, that doesn't happen. I mean, I respect the guy's courage, but no generals have been relieved of their commands, and no civilian leadership has been held accountable as a result of what happened a couple of weeks ago, nor will they be. Now, as I understand it, he was a talented officer who was, in the ascension in his career and probably would have had a pretty good chance of pinning on the star himself here in a couple of years. And he would have been, in my opinion, would have made a greater impact by walking the walk as a general officer. And so my advice to all of those officers out there who are frustrated with the leadership that we all sometimes see at the senior levels, or lack of leadership that we sometimes see at the senior levels, my advice to those officers is get promoted and change it. That's how it's going to change. It's not going to change through a one-man protest. It's going to change through the right people making it up into the ranks, because we're going to go to war again. There's another war in our future. And, the generation of Marines and officers who are coming up now are going to be the ones who fight it. So when you find yourself as that person who is now that senior leader, don't be the senior leader you told yourself you'd never be. When something happens, it's obviously your responsibility. Live up to your ethos, which you expect everybody else to do, and be the one to say, hey, that was on me. And lead by example. That's how this is going to change. That's the only way it's going to change. And here's a perfect example of it. You had an entire generation of officers that came out of Vietnam that said, we're never going to do any of the idiocy that we saw in Vietnam. And that generation of officers made that promise to themselves and to the servicemen. And so if you looked at the military of the 80s and 90s, and the military that we took to Desert Shield and Desert Storm, they were all led by Vietnam vets who were like, listen, we're not doing that again. Overall, we're not going to make those same mistakes. And that directly led to, our military primacy that we have now, as a result of that generation of officers saying, yeah, look, we're not making those mistakes again. And they took it personally. That's how you affect change in uniform. And it doesn't happen as fast as we'd like it. It doesn't happen as clean as we'd like it. And again, I have respect for the lieutenant colonel for having the courage to say what we were all thinking. And he wasn't wrong. There are people who need to be held accountable, but it's going to be up to the next generation of officers who ascend to that level to make those changes. And it's not going to happen through a one-man protest.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you, sir, for coming out. I think we really had a really great conversation. I definitely would like to do this again at some other time. Thank you so much for just the inspiration your words have been, and just the way that you're, just talking the different, about what you've been through, and about how, again, it's not something you can read in a book. It's just something that you got to live through. And I'm really glad to have met with you. Is there anything that you want to end with? Anything that you want to say to anybody out there before we?
Well, first of all, thank you again for letting me do this. I'll always be a Marine. The Marine Corps. I owe more to the Marine Corps than I can ever possibly give back. And whatever success I have in life going forward will be directly contributed to, my time in uniform. So anytime I get the opportunity to give back, I'm going to take advantage of that opportunity. And I love the Marine Corps. I'll be honest, there were times I was frustrated with our beloved service, as we all are sometimes. But yeah, I love the Marine Corps. I love being a Marine, and whenever I get the chance to give back, I will. It was an honor and a privilege to serve alongside some of the finest human beings I've ever met. And it was an honor and privilege to lead Marines in combat. And like I said, there isn't a day that doesn't go by where I don't think about the Marines that I didn't bring home, or their families. But to say that I'm proud would be an understatement.
Amen. Well, thanks a lot, sir. I really appreciate it. And I'll talk to you soon. Have a good night.
Thank you. You do the same.